I never expected our wedding day to become the beginning of the most shocking revelation of my life. Sarah and I had just returned from our honeymoon in Tuscany, still glowing with newlywed bliss when the package arrived. It was a Tuesday morning and I was making coffee while Sarah sorted through the mountain of wedding gifts we'd received. Most were the usual suspects: crystal vases, kitchen appliances, and monogrammed towels from our registry. But this one was different. The package sat on our kitchen counter like a riddle wrapped in brown paper. No return address, just our names written in elegant script that seemed oddly familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd seen it before. The postmark was local, dated 3 days after our wedding. Sarah picked it up, turning it over in her hands with curiosity dancing in her green eyes. "Who do you think sent this?" she asked, shaking it gently. Something inside shifted with a soft, muffled sound. Not the clink of china or the rattle of silverware, but something more mysterious. "Maybe it's from your dad's mysterious business associates," I joked, referring to her father's tendency to keep his professional life private. James Morrison had always been cordial to me, but there was something enigmatic about him that I could never quite pin down. He spoke in measured tones, asked probing questions, and had an uncanny ability to redirect conversations away from himself. Sarah laughed, but I noticed a flicker of something, uncertainty perhaps, cross her face. "Dad doesn't really talk about work much," she said, already reaching for the scissors. "But he did seem unusually emotional during the father-daughter dance. Maybe this is his way of expressing something he couldn't say out loud." As she carefully cut through the tape, I found myself holding my breath. Call it intuition or perhaps just the overactive imagination of a mystery novel enthusiast, but something about this gift felt significant. The morning sunlight streaming through our kitchen window seemed to intensify, casting long shadows across the unwrapped package as Sarah lifted the lid of a simple wooden box nestled inside. Inside the wooden box lay an assortment of items that made absolutely no sense together. There was a faded black and white photograph of a young woman I didn't recognize, a brass military button, a folded piece of yellowed newspaper, and most puzzling of all, a small leather journal tied with a red ribbon. Sarah picked up the photograph first, studying the woman's face with growing confusion. "I've never seen her before," she murmured, turning the photo over. In faded ink, someone had written Berlin 1962, along with initials I couldn't make out. The woman in the photo was stunningly beautiful, with dark hair and eyes that held a mixture of sadness and determination. Something about her expression reminded me of Sarah, though I couldn't identify exactly what. The newspaper clipping was from the Washington Post, dated October 1963, with a headline about a diplomatic incident involving East German defectors. Most of the article was too faded to read clearly, but I could make out mentions of classified intelligence and international implications. The brass button appeared to be military with an eagle insignia that looked European, possibly German. But it was the journal that truly captured our attention. The leather was worn smooth from handling, and when Sarah untied the ribbon, the pages fell open to reveal entries written in the same elegant script as our names on the package. The first entry was dated June 15, 1961, and began with words that made my blood run cold. "Today I made the most difficult decision of my life. I must leave everything behind and become someone else entirely." Sarah's hands trembled as she read aloud. The entries spoke of a double life, of secrets that could destroy families, of a love that transcended political boundaries. The writer described crossing borders under cover of darkness, assuming new identities, and making sacrifices that no parent should ever have to make. Each entry was more cryptic than the last, filled with references to the mission, the children who must never know, and the price of freedom. "Sarah," I said quietly, a terrible suspicion forming in my mind, "what exactly do you know about your father's past? About how he came to America?" She looked up at me with wide eyes, the journal still open in her lap. "He always said he immigrated from Scotland in the 1960s for business opportunities. He met my mother in New York and I was born 2 years later." Her voice grew smaller with each word. "But now I'm wondering if everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie." The next few days became a blur of research and discovery that shattered everything Sarah thought she knew about her identity. We started with the photograph, running it through image search engines and genealogy websites. Nothing came up initially, but when I enhanced the photo digitally and cropped it to focus on the woman's face, We found something that made Sarah's coffee cup slip from her hands. The woman in the 1962 Berlin photograph was featured in a 1963 news article about the wife of a high-ranking East German intelligence officer who had disappeared without a trace. Her name was Ingrid Mueller, and according to the article, she had vanished along with classified documents that could have compromised dozens of Western intelligence operations. The article speculated that she had either been eliminated by her own government or had successfully defected to the West. Sarah stared at the screen in stunned silence. The woman in Dad's gift. She looks exactly like the painting in his study. The one he always said was of some distant Scottish relative. Her voice was barely a whisper. But this article says she was German. And married to someone named Klaus Mueller. I pulled up more research on Klaus Mueller and felt my stomach drop. He had been a key figure in East German intelligence, responsible for recruiting Western assets and managing deep cover operations. But what made my hands shake was a small detail buried in a CIA declassified document from 1995. Klaus Mueller had been suspected of operating a long-term sleeper agent in the United States under the identity of James Morrison, a Scottish businessman who had immigrated to New York in 1964. Sarah, I think your father might not be who he says he is, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I think he might be Klaus Mueller, and the woman in the photograph, Ingrid, was his wife. Your mother. She shook her head vehemently. That's impossible. My mother died when I was 3. Dad raised me alone. He's always been American, always been. She trailed off, her face going pale as memories seemed to resurface. He does speak German sometimes in his sleep. And he has those old European coins in his desk drawer that he says are from coin collecting, but they're all from East Germany. We spent the evening going through the journal more carefully, and the picture that emerged was devastating. The writer, who we now suspected was Klaus Mueller, described the agonizing decision to abandon his life as an intelligence officer and disappear into American suburbia. He wrote about assuming the identity of a dead Scottish immigrant, about learning to suppress his accent, about the constant fear of discovery. Most heartbreaking of all, he wrote about watching his daughter grow up while never being able to tell her who she really was or where she came from. The confrontation with James Morrison, or Klaus Mueller, took place on a rainy Thursday evening at his house in Westchester. Sarah had called ahead, saying only that we needed to discuss the wedding gift. When we arrived, he was waiting in his study, the very room where the mysterious painting of Ingrid had hung for Sarah's entire life. But now the painting was gone, replaced by an empty hook on the wall. I've been waiting for this conversation for 28 years, he said before we could even sit down. His voice carried an accent I'd never noticed before. Subtle but distinctly European. I wondered if this day would ever come, or if I would take these secrets to my grave. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, the journal clutched in her hands. Are you my father? She asked, her voice breaking. Are you really James Morrison from Scotland, or are you Klaus Mueller from East Germany? He aged 10 years in the span of her question. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked vulnerable and tired. I am both and I am neither, he said quietly. James Morrison is who I became to protect you. Klaus Mueller is who I was when I fell in love with your mother and made choices that changed the course of 3 lives forever. He moved to his desk and pulled out a thick folder that looked like it had been prepared for this moment for decades. Inside were documents, photographs, and official papers that told the complete story. Klaus Mueller had indeed been an East German intelligence officer, but he had also been a double agent working for the CIA since 1960. When his cover was blown in 1963, the agency had orchestrated his disappearance and given him a new identity in America. Your mother, Ingrid, was never an intelligence officer, he explained, his eyes fixed on Sarah's face. She was a librarian who got caught up in my world through no fault of her own. When I had to disappear, I brought her with me, but the stress of our new life, the constant fear of discovery, the isolation from everything she had ever known, it destroyed her health. She died not from cancer as I told you, but from a broken heart. Sarah sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face. So everything about my childhood, about our family, about who I am, it's all been a lie? No, he said firmly, kneeling beside her chair. The love I have for you is real. The man who taught you to ride a bicycle, who helped you with homework, who walked you down the aisle last month. That man is real. He's the best parts of both Klaus Mueller and James Morrison. He's the father who chose to sacrifice everything, including his own identity, to give you a safe and normal life. As we sat in that study, surrounded by the revelations that had turned Sarah's world upside down, her father, and I realized I would always think of him as her father, regardless of his name, explained the true meaning of the wedding gift. The items in the box weren't random mementos. They were carefully chosen symbols of a life he was finally ready to share with the daughter he had protected through decades of silence. The photograph of your mother was taken during our last happy day in Berlin before everything changed, he said, his voice thick with emotion. The newspaper clipping documents the official end of Klaus Mueller's existence. The military button belonged to my father, who died fighting against fascism in World War II. I wanted you to know that whatever else I may have done, I came from people who believed in doing what was right even when it was dangerous. The journal, he explained, had been his way of processing the impossible decisions he'd had to make. I wrote in it whenever the weight of the secrets became unbearable. Every entry was a letter to you that I could never send, an explanation I could never give. Until now. Sarah wiped her tears and looked at the man who had raised her with such love and dedication. Why now? Why tell me all of this after my wedding? Because you're starting your own family now, he said, glancing at me with something that might have been approval. And I realized that secrets, no matter how well-intentioned, have a way of poisoning the very relationships they're meant to protect. I didn't want you to discover the truth accidentally or worse from someone else. I wanted you to hear it from me in my own words, so you could understand that every lie I told was an act of love. We spent the next several hours going through documents, photographs, and stories that filled in the gaps of Sarah's family history. Her father showed us letters from CIA handlers, commendations for intelligence work that had saved American lives, and documentation of the new identity program that had given them their American life. Most surprisingly, he revealed that he had been in contact with surviving members of Ingrid's family in Germany, and that Sarah had relatives she had never known existed. There's one more thing, he said as the evening drew to a close. From his desk drawer he pulled out a small velvet box. This was your mother's engagement ring. I could never bear to look at it after she died, but I always planned to give it to you when you got married. I thought perhaps you might want to have it reset or simply keep it as a connection to the woman who loved you more than life itself, even though you were too young to remember her. Sarah opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant sapphire ring surrounded by tiny diamonds. As she slipped it onto her right hand, I saw her father's shoulders relax for the first time all evening. The weight of 30 years of secrets was finally lifting, and in its place was something I hadn't expected to see: relief and perhaps even a kind of peace. The wedding gift had been exactly what it appeared to be: a father's love for his daughter, expressed in the only way he knew how. But it was also something more. It was the gift of truth, offered at the moment when Sarah was strong enough to handle it and wise enough to understand that love sometimes requires the courage to reveal our most carefully guarded secrets. As we drove home that night, Sarah reached across the car and took my hand. "I married into quite a family, didn't I?" she said with a shaky laugh. "You married into a family that loves you enough to risk everything to keep you safe," I replied. "And now you know the whole truth about where that love comes from." The mysterious wedding gift had revealed far more than the true identity of Sarah's father. It had shown us that families are built not just on blood and DNA, but on the daily choice to love and protect each other regardless of the cost. And sometimes, the greatest gift a parent can give their child is the courage to finally tell them who they really are. To support the channel, please leave a like and subscribe. Thank you so much.